webinar with us. Thank you for recording. But I want to, especially welcome all the attendees of the webinar. As I mentioned, we had 100 people register for this. I hope we get close to that because there's so much interest in this project. And so many of you have been following this process now for, well over a year as we started to kick it off and recruit design teams and work through all the 3 design rounds and get through a jury selection process and recommendations, and then finally culminating in a city council vote in January of this year. And it's been really exciting to have so much engagement from community members and from folks that care about Oceanside's beaches. Just follow us through this. So to everyone that is joining as part of a long sequence of engagement, thank you for sticking with us and for continuing to be part of this project. And for those of you that might be tuning in for the first time, thanks so much for being interested. This is a wonderful time to start getting connected to this process. There's a lot of important milestones that we're going to be going through over the coming months. And this is just kind of one moment in a series of moments that are going to be happening in the future where we can all collectively shape this important project for the city and for the region. The meeting is being recorded, as is noted at the top of your screen. This is to ensure that we can, reach as many people as possible. I'll also note there is another live webinar on Thursday at 3 p.m., correct? And that webinar you register for separately. You're welcome to join that one as well if you're not already registered. It's just an opportunity to field more questions, but the content will be the same. So just a couple notes to kick us off on kind of like what we're trying to accomplish with this meeting, just to go over the objectives and the agenda. I think we have a slide for this, but I might be wrong. We're gonna cover, the project, kind of where it is, and what the overview of it is. So if you haven't been following along, we'll make sure everyone on the call understands what the proposed conceptual design is, and what the elements of the project are. We'll then get into a discussion of the criteria that the project team has been using to kind of think about, where we might cite the pilot and the methodology that's behind that. And then we want to pause and have a really robust Q&A conversation and hear feedback on the criteria, because the criteria is really going to drive the decision-making by the city on, where the pilot should be cited. So if we're missing something from the criteria, or if the criteria isn't clear to you, we want to make sure everyone can understand what that is. We're then going to turn for the second half of the conversation about the segment and the layout considerations of the proposed pilot project. There's several different elements to the project and how they get configured and where they are in the context of different segments of the beach and Oceanside, are an important thing for the team in the city to think about. So we want to have a conversation about that where we present and then hear feedback from you all. Our objectives for this meeting: we want participants to understand and weigh in on the criteria being used to determine the optimum location for the Rebeach pilot. We want participants to understand the process for analyzing the 3 coastal segments where the pilot should be cited. And we want all of you to be introduced to the physical layouts that are recommended per coastal segment. So this agenda reflects that ambition. If you could go to the next slide, Nick. So as I mentioned, it's being recorded. You should have been notified by Zoom about that. If you have issues about that, you're of course free to leave the meeting if you're uncomfortable with that, but no one's video is being presented except for the speakers. So if you don't see your video, that's not an error, that's how it's set up. The second thing to note is that we will be collecting your questions throughout. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel tray. And you can, as we go through, enter questions through this. And our team will be kind of collecting these questions. And then when we get to the Q&A, we'll be reading them out loud and sorting them if if it makes sense to answer them there. We also will be answering some of the questions just directly in chat, because that'll be or giving written answers, I should say. So feel free, as questions, come up, you can just kind of type them in the Q&A prompt. And then when we get to the Q&A segment, we'll kind of facilitate a conversation around what gets asked. The other thing to note is we have a chat function. Some folks are already doing this. Use it for like technical support or like how to encourage like any questions about the interface. And we have team members that are working on that. That's really for technical questions. Don't use the chat to ask questions from the panelists. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We also do have captions enabled for this. So if it's helpful to you, if you're in a public space and you don't have earphones, you can turn on captions. Or if it's helpful for you to understand what people are talking about, we do have live captioning engaged. I think the only other thing I wanted to share was just that we have 6 folks from the Rebeach team on the screen. We won't always be on video, but I just want to call out the incredible team that's been working on this process. Joining me, from the RCC side are, Carolyn and Jen, who work with Farallon Strategies. They're part of the kind of engagement team that's been supporting the city in GHD. We have Nick Sadrapour and Brian Leslie from GHD, and of course, Jamie Timberlake from the city of Oceanside, your own coastal zone administrator. And I'll actually pass it over to Jamie now, who's going to take us through the next part of this.
All right, thanks so much for joining tonight, guys. Tuesday night, I hope you're enjoying some tacos while you listen to this webinar, and I hope that's giving you some food for thought and you'll have some good questions for us as we move through this presentation. So I just want to make sure I'm going to catch everyone up to speed on Rebeach before we get into this very specific webinar about siting the pilot project. So Rebeach is Oceanside's coastal resilience initiative that aims to improve and prolong our sand management efforts and restore or re-beach our shoreline. This is a city-led effort. It began in 2020 with a year-long feasibility study that identified sort of deficiencies in our current coastal management efforts, and it as well as gave us a suite of possible solutions to lessen our long-term beach erosion problem. So the feasibility study, it concluded with some recommendations, one of which was that we needed to seek out a high quality source of sand that we could use for a beach nourishment program. And this is a higher quality source of sand than we're used to seeing on our beaches. Most of our sand that we see comes from our harbor, which is really fine grained and not the greatest quality. So that was one big recommendation that came from the feasibility study. The other recommendation was that the beach nourishment program needed to be combined with a retention mechanism that could assist with retaining sand. Since what we see in general is that sand doesn't really like to stay on our beaches for very long. We see this through our consistent surveys that we conduct on our beaches, as well as anecdotally, of course, you notice how the beaches look these days. So at an August 2021 public workshop, the City Council gave staff the direction to pursue these recommendations that were given in the feasibility study, and specifically staff was directed to move forward with the environmental analysis design and permitting of a pilot project that would provide both beach nourishment and sand retention options. So cut to 2023, the City Council approved a contract with GHD for the sand nourishment and retention pilot project. And so that's the contract we're working under now. The main tasks under this contract include community and stakeholder engagement, which we're doing tonight, baseline monitoring development, engineering analysis and design, which is the current stage of our process, and environmental compliance and permitting. Want to hit the next slide, Nick? Thank you. So last summer, as you may remember, Oceanside hosted the Rebeach Oceanside International Design Competition, which gave the city an opportunity to see what kinds of beach erosion solutions were out there already being tested in the world that we could borrow from other communities that were dealing with similar coastal stressors. So the final competition hosted, or the finalists of the competition included competitors from New York City, from the Netherlands, and from the Gold Coast of Australia. The competitors were given the parameters for the competition, which were completely in line with the feasibility study, with those recommendations from the feasibility study. And that was to design a sand retention feature that would restore and maintain sand along the coast while providing additional benefits to the community and increase the efficiency and extend the benefits of any and all of our sand nourishment efforts that the city, the region, or the federal government may carry forward. Next slide. So we did a lot of public outreach for this, and so we feel real good heading into this next round of public outreach. The competition finalists took part in 3 design rounds, and each of those design rounds culminated with a presentation to the public at an in-person public workshop. The 3 design rounds they gave an opportunity for the public to give feedback back to the design competitors directly, and that feedback was incorporated into the designs that came out in the final competition. All of these workshops were very well attended, or 150 to 220 people participating at each workshop. So it's really important to just recognize that, you've been a part of this for a long time. We've been reaching out to you for a long time. Please continue to stay involved. Your involvement is really key to the success of this project. And I really thank you very much. Let's move to the next one, please. So there's also been a lot of regional interests. So given the regional interest and the potential effect of this implemented project at various scales, the project team has shared updates with regional stakeholders throughout the ReBeach process. Informational presentations have been given to city councils or the designated commissions for all of the cities to the south of us, including Carlsbad, Encinitas, Solana Beach, and Del Mar. And then additional regional outreach has also been conducted at a myriad of local and regional stakeholder meetings and events, and some of those are listed here. This concentrated regional outreach will continue throughout the environmental compliance, permitting, and construction phases of this pilot project. So this is not the last you'll hear from us. You can go to the next slide. So after the final design round and 3rd public workshop, the jury deliberated and decided on the winning design competitor. The jury was comprised of local and regional coastal experts and leaders, and they unanimously approved this living speed bumps design concept as the winning design, which was also followed by a unanimous council approval in January 2024. So this is the design that we're moving forward with for our sand nourishment and retention pilot project. The living speed bumps design concept brought forward by International Coastal Management from Australia embodies 3 retention devices and onshore and nearshore beach nourishment. So 2 of the constructs here will act as headlands that will help stabilize the dry sand beach space. These headlands are constructed to extend out at grade about 150 feet off the back beach, and they're supported by a buried rock toe. And in the offshore areas, an artificial reef will be constructed and placed at a depth of approximately 20 to 40 feet, roughly 900 feet offshore. And this reef will provide some energy dissipation, which will encourage development of sand in the lee of the structure and on the sides of it. And it will lessen wave attack on the dry sand beach areas. So both of these elements will be supplemented with nourishment for the design life of the structure. And that's really key to understand that we're going to need to maintain this. And we plan to maintain this. And the 2 headlands, artificial reef, and that maintenance regimen will help us retain the sand and require a lot less of this, big push for maintenance needs like we have right now. So though the ICM team grounded this concept in the geographic location that we see here, the pilot project could be implemented in several places along the coast. So determining the location of the pilot is why we're here tonight. As you review our analysis of the possible locations of where the pilot could be sited, it's important to keep in mind the overall objective, which is to place the pilot where it can best showcase the benefits that it can offer us. If we can prove that this concept works, which is novel to Oceanside and novel to Southern California, we have a much higher likelihood of installing several more reefs and headlands that can aid in restoring the beach across the entirety of Oceanside's coastline. Performance of this pilot project needs to be top of mind as you listen to the analysis performed to date by the project team. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Nick Sadripour, Senior Coastal Scientist with GHD, and the prime consultant that oversees both the design and the permitting of this pilot project.
Thanks, Jamie. Confirming that you guys can hear me okay. All right. So good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Sadripour. As Jamie said, I'm a senior coastal scientist with GHD, the consultants to city and leading Rebeach. And we're really excited to talk to you tonight about the siting analysis and kind of orient you to how we're approaching the methodology and how we're looking at choosing a potential location for the pilot project. For some of you who participated through the council workshop in January, you might remember we broke down the, which is largely, south of Oceanside Pier, into these 3 segments that were identified, using natural breaks in the coastline, major roadways, natural coastal features, public access ways, along with the existing coastal management considerations in them. That's how we landed at these 3 segments. And so tonight, I'm going to walk through kind of how we're viewing the pilot project concept in these segments. First, I'm going to go through kind of the overall methodology and the criteria, and then we'll pause for some Q&A, and then we'll go into kind of the potential layouts in individual segments in more detail. So trying to orient you to some assumptions and how we're framing this siting analysis is, we view that the pilot project concept can be optimized for any of the segments to meet the anticipated performance goals of the project. We also view that the benefits of the pilot project are going to extend beyond that specific location, meaning that if a project is installed in one location, we anticipate the benefits to be much broader due to not only the stabilization that we're hoping to provide, but also the beach nourishment component that we're bringing new sand supply to this coastline and adjacent shorelines. That being said, we view implementation of the pilot project concept as feasible in all the segments. However, the ease of implementation across the segments and the trade-offs between the benefits and challenges of implementation are going to vary across the different segments. So overall tonight, and our larger project goal and intent is to try to implement one pilot project concept, which is, as Jamie mentioned, the 2 headlands with 1 reef and beach nourishment, to monitor and learn from that pilot concept, develop future projects for the rest of Oceanside shoreline after we have this pilot project, and we can kind of understand its performance, what management's needed, and then design additional strategies as needed. So that being said, future phases of looking at coastal resilience for Oceanside might not be a direct copy and paste. And so we're kind of keeping in mind that trying to pick a location, get it implemented, and learn from it will help guide our broader coastal resilience goals going forward for the city. So tonight, and through the siting analysis, our goal is really to evaluate the potential locations. What are we gonna look at and evaluate in order to help create an objective framework for determining the appropriate location? We're hoping to select and determine the appropriate criteria, look for a recommended layout in each of the segments, and then assess those recommended layouts against that criteria. And for you, we're really hoping to get feedback on, is the methods that we're using clear and appropriate? Did we pick the right criteria? Is there something that we missed? Are there any layouts or locations that should also be considered that were not fairly considered through our methodology and process? And I'll walk through in a little bit more detail some of our assumptions in this process before highlighting the methodology more specifically. So in talking about the specific winning concept of the two headlands reef with nourishment, we really are viewing that the headlands should connect to an existing public accessway and facilitate both the public access as well as emergency services and lifeguard access at that headland connection. So kind of the beach coastline to that land connective point. We're also applying the ICM concept dimensions as is, meaning we haven't shifted the size or shapes for a particular feature, the headlands or the reef, from the winning design competition. We anticipate those refinements and optimization happening at a later stage once we have a location selected. As we're evaluating the different criteria, where we have numbers, we're going to use them and use quantitative metrics. Where we don't have numbers, we're going to use a relative scale and use a more qualitative approach. And as we walk through the criteria, some of them have additional assumptions embedded within them, but these assumptions kind of are overarching assessment or overarching assumptions for the analysis. And so walking through kind of stepwise through our methodology, with the gray kind of highlighting like where we are to date, with the blue flagging where we're hoping to go, is, right now we've divided the project area into the 3 segments. We're hoping to determine the appropriate criteria for the analysis, evaluate potential layouts in each using this criteria, and then screen the potential layouts to come up with a recommended layout per segment. So that means we're hoping to come with 1 layout per each of those 3 segments. That's the highest scoring layout to then plug into this multi-criteria analysis that could help us as inform this decision-making process in determining a location for the pilot project. As I mentioned, I'm going to walk through the different criteria that we've selected for the multi-criteria analysis. These are the criteria that we have, and I might just take it a step back. You may be asking yourself, what is a multi-criteria analysis? Essentially, it's a common practice for determining trade-offs and creating a matrix for a decision support tool. It takes into account social, technical, and environmental factors, and we're hoping to apply that into the deciding of the pilot project to present an objective approach to determining a location. You might see different multi-criteria analysis when you're looking for a product online. They might have cost, quality, color, and size, and different grades for each of those categories. We're essentially trying to do the same thing and come up with a score for each of the criteria that then will be tallied up for each of the segments, and that'll help us evaluate the trade-offs between those layouts and the segments against each other. There was a similar multi-criteria analysis for the feasibility study. Obviously, we're tweaking it a little bit to kind of look at a location versus alternatives. But as we walk through each of these 12 criteria in the next few slides, I'll explain some examples, and I'll highlight a few high scores that are good and a few low scores that are less good, or represent more challenges in a trade-off and when we're thinking about implementing a pilot project. So first up is creation, restoration of beach over the design life. This criteria essentially is the performance of the pilot project. Our performance goals are looking at the creation of an initial 100-foot wide beach, and then maintenance of a stable and dry beach over the project's 20-year lifespan. And our current view is that we assume that we can meet this performance goal in each of the segment. So that's to say that we anticipate this score for each of the segments to be equal. Now, the additional assumption within that is that we assume that there's funding available to ensure that we can meet that goal in each of the segment, recognizing the different adaptation or implementation challenges that might occur, but that we are able to meet that performance goal regardless of the segment with the pilot project concept. For the next criteria is sediment supply to adjacent beaches. This criteria assesses the anticipated long-term sediment supply response, an increase or decrease of the project outside of the immediate pilot project extent. Importantly, this includes beach nourishment management strategies. So we anticipate this strategy to result in an increase of sediment supply in the region because we're bringing a lot of new sand to the area, and that there's monitoring and management strategies that will be established to make sure we mitigate any of the sediment supply effects that might be detrimental. So similar to the other criteria, this criteria we assume to be equal across the segments, meaning that we can achieve the same level of a positive benefit to the region, regardless of the segment. Now, you might be asking why did we choose these criteria when we're working through that they might be equal? We felt that these two are some of the most important criteria when evaluating this project, the performance and then sediment supply, and that it's worthwhile to include them in this analysis, even if we anticipate them being equal, if we're assuming them to be equal across potential locations. All right, coastal access and amenities. So this criteria is really looking at those existing public features, access ways, parking lots, lifeguard facilities, parks, open space, restrooms, showers, things that are providing that additional amenity at that beach to a user group. Again, given the diversity of amenities, some locations are better supported by certain amenities than other locations, and the location and type of public amenity can really help us think about how the pilot project location might be able to leverage those features in a particular location. The next criteria is property risk assessment. And so this criteria is looking to account for risks and uncertainties associated with the pilot project. Now, the uncertainty of effects is, and why we're looking at this is due to the experimental nature of the project. You know, this is a pilot project, it's innovative. It's the first of its kind that's kind of gotten to this level in California in terms of the project goals. And, you know, from our example and thinking through this, you know, if a pilot project would negatively affect the shoreline, we're assuming that the city's legal risk increases in proportion with the number of private properties. So just like this photo is a good example that if the pilot project resulted in some effect on the shoreline, that affecting public infrastructure would be less risky for the city. Whereas if it was a private revetment or home where this lifeguard tower is, that would be viewed as a higher risk to the city. The next criteria is private or public property entitlements. And you might be asking yourself, you know, what's an entitlement? Generally, these are approvals, use approvals needed for implementing a development or project in an area. We're really focusing this as what is that connectivity between the headland and the coast? You know, that boundary between beach and water, and then on the land. And particularly assessing where there's private versus public property boundaries and the uncertainties with how those connections could be managed in the long term. So again, you know, thinking through the example of a headland connection that has more private property adjacent to the headland, we anticipate there to be a greater challenge in gaining right of entry permits for construction or future maintenance modification, as well as long-term access, thinking about, you know, potential agreements that are going to be made between the city and that private property on the shoreline. On the other hand, where the headland is fully connected to city property, we foresee there to be less obstacles and challenges into getting those long-term access, the construction permits, the use permits, and the long-term permissions and approvals, viewing this headland structure to be, you know, something that's out there for 2 decades or more. The next criteria that we're looking at is just constructability, and this is the general feasibility of that initial construction of the pilot project, including the headlands and reef. We do assume that the reef is going to be similar across those areas, but the headland construction is not going to be equal at each of the segments. So we're looking at areas where there is land-based access for equipment, certain areas that are more restrictive. This image is a good one of the recent Army Corps project in Encinitas, where it's a really tight bluff beach, and getting vehicles onto the beach in certain areas along that segment is more challenging than in other areas where you might have direct routes for a vehicle to get to. So we're looking at where you might need to install temporary haul routes for equipment or materials as you construct the headlands. Now, a related criteria is going to be just the general cost of construction. And we're looking at just the initial construction cost. So thinking about the staging area for the work, that proximity to the actual project site, factoring in how we're going to get equipment from that staging area to the project site, and potentially additional material that might be needed to connect those two areas. And we're looking at how certain layouts and that construction, that initial construction constraints in certain areas might result in an increased construction cost relative to other areas that might have a lot more easily, readily available connections for construction equipment and staging areas. So adaptive management is another criteria. So this criteria is looking at just constraints primarily associated with having to go out and do routine maintenance or significant modification of the headlands, kind of focused on that landward boundary again, thinking about access, especially, or, potentially and especially during those severely eroded beach dates. So when the beach is severely eroded, making sure there's ability for construction vehicles and to get out there and provide the maintenance needed, or for the modification needed for that long-term adaptive management. Again, we're anticipated this to be easier and cheaper when it's adjacent to public property, and a little bit more complex and costly when it's adjacent to private property. Moving over to kind of some environmental factors, we've split our biological resources into marine subtidal and marine intertidal. So this criteria is focused on biological resources in the subtidal, so that's below water, and trying to assess the potential risks of negative impacts from either direct burial or habitat conversion. Habitat conversion meaning kind of shifting from, say, subtidal sandy habitat to this new artificial reef habitat, a rocky reef habitat. And so we're assuming that we're going to be doing some level of habitat conversion for the reef component, and where there's existing offshore biological resources, we're going to have to take that in consideration when we're citing the reef location. Moving just to the land a little bit, thinking about biological resources in the intertidal or the beach, this criteria is looking at the potential impacts to the back beach and intertidal components of the project. I have on here, some of the existing conditions along Oceanside shoreline, that cobble, the revetment and riprap, and then obviously some grunions on the right that use and really need that sandy beach area for the reproductive development, and trying to understand where there might be trade-offs or challenges for intertidal ecosystems depending on the location. That's what this criteria is trying to address. Just a couple more, and then we'll take your questions. So surfing resources, something that we've talked about a lot throughout this project. This is looking at potential impacts to the existing resources. And, when we're thinking about this, a segment with potentially higher surf quality, higher number of users, that represents an area that has potential for a greater amount of negative change. And so we would look at a place that has high quality resources now as getting a low score for this category, whereas a segment with the existing kind of low surf quality or low number of users would represent an area with greater potential for a neutral or potential positive change and receive a higher score for this criteria. And finally, public and marine safety, which has come up a lot for this project. This criteria is looking at potential alterations to lifeguard services and lifeguard operations, and how to maintain that existing level of marine safety, and looking for, how can we leverage the vehicle access points as well as, the existing lifeguard headquarters and lifeguard towers that are stationed across the shoreline. So I know that was a lot. And again, we hope to use this criteria to evaluate as best possible the main parameters that will influence the ease of implementation and logistical considerations of constructing the pilot. We'll take some questions in just a moment, and just flagging for folks, the next set of slides are going to go into more detail about each segment and potential layouts, but hoping to kind of address the questions about methodology, overall approach, and criteria now. So I think Sam's going to be our facilitator for the Q&A. I know there's already a few in there.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Nick, so much for walking through that. And just to reiterate, the kind of what we want to make sure is that everyone understands what the criteria are, what they mean, why they're in the list for the multi-criteria analysis, and what we're going to be doing with the MCA. So I want to, we've been answering a bunch of questions just through the Q&A text box. So note that there's already 4 questions that have been answered there, but there's a few open questions that we wanted to answer, just take them live. So I'm going to start with 2 from Matt McDaniel that are kind of related. It's just looking for some clarity, Nick, on 2 of the criteria, 1 coastal access and amenities and 1 on private public entitlements. So I'll just ask them as a single question. Coastal access and amenities is an MCA criteria. Isn't that circular reasoning because the project itself would provide coastal access and encourage building of amenities? We've actually talked about this a lot as a project team, so I'm glad you asked the question, Matt. And then second, regarding public-private entitlements, isn't that the same? How can you use the criteria for site selection if that's precisely the intent of the project itself? I think there's a little bit of a definitional thing with that, Nick, but I wondered if you could speak to those 2 questions.
Yeah, let's start with the coastal access and amenities. Yes, the point is to create a new public beach space, or restore some public beach space using these structural features and beach nourishment. I think how we view this, and again through our assumptions, is that we assume that the headlands should be connected to existing public access ways, and that's, I would say there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, physically getting to the beach and coastal logistics of whether that's parking, biking, walking, and then for the lifeguards, making sure that they could have their vehicles access the headlands. That was a big part of trying to focus along those existing coastal resources and leverage those existing coastal resources, recognizing that we will be adding that public beach space to those existing resources. So it's, in our mind, it's trying to build off of what's already there, while we understand that there's a lot of places that where coastal amenities can be upgraded through different projects or mechanisms. But for our purposes of trying to cite the pilot project, using the existing coastal amenities was the way forward that we felt was a good approach.
Can I add to, thanks,
Of course.
Nick. I just want to add that in addition to what Nick is saying, that we're going to be providing these additional coastal amenities, we want those coastal amenities to be reached to the widest group of people. And so that's why a lot of the kind of priority or scoring tends to go higher for some of those areas where there's already a parking lot, there's already access to the rail, because those are going to reach the most people. And if you recall, like back to the objectives of the overall Rebeach pilot project, this is a multi-benefit project. So we're hoping to reach a wide audience and provide many different benefits. And that gives coastal access a high ranking if we already have existing coastal access there. And that really just means like the infrastructure to allow folks to get to these areas.
And I think that'll become a little bit more clear as in the next set of slides when we walk through each of the segments and the potential layouts. With regards to the private public entitlements, I don't think I wouldn't say that's the intent of this project. You know, the main goal of this project, it's a sand retention project, trying to bring back and stabilize a beach. What we're talking about for the entitlements, and yeah, I apologize if I mixed up some words on the definition, is for the headlands where they connect to the land, that actual boundary line, and if they're connecting to private property versus connecting to public property, represents different challenges and trade-offs in terms of implementation and then ongoing maintenance and management. So that would be how I would describe the difference between how we're viewing it as a criteria versus kind of the main project objective. I don't know, Jamie, if there's anything else you wanted.
No, that's fine. That's great. I basically exactly what you said. It's that division of how do we implement something over private property. We're going to have a lot of discussions with folks, and we're going to have to do some of those negotiations. It's not undoable, but it is a complication, and so that's why this is one of the criteria that we're analyzing.
Thanks so much, Jamie and Nick. I want to elevate another question that's on this issue of kind of understanding the criteria, and this one from Steve Maskew. Hi, Steve. Was there any consideration of the permittability of the selected site as part of the criteria? For example, I understand it will be more difficult, e.g. take longer, to obtain a permit from areas where there are tributaries, like BV Lagoon or Buccaneer Beach, or is that included in one of the 12 criteria? So the basic question is like, what about the permittability? Is it kind of one criteria? Or is it kind of like a cluster of these? And I'll bounce that to Nick first, and then maybe Jamie, if she has any more.
Yeah, for strictly permittability, I think we're trying to factor in all of them and separate out either specific regulatory agencies or a specific permit where we can. You know, for example, like the reef might require a different set of approvals than the headland, depending on where that headland's located, which are going to be a little bit different too than just the beach nourishment. But we are looking to kind of package them through an environmental document together. I think when in specifically talking about lagoons or the lagoon inlets, Buena Vista or Buccaneer, I think in our view, trying to not create additional challenges for the city who already has to go in and mechanically breach at least Buccaneer, and trying to work with the system as much as we can, recognizing how altered that system is, has been top of mind when we're looking at these recommended sites. I would say it's kind of captured in the bioresources, it's captured a little bit in coastal access amenities and constructability. I wouldn't say that there's just one specific criteria that's addressing permitting kind of on its own, but it's kind of captured within there.
Yeah, if you can, like, if you think of the Coastal Act, you know, kind of a lot of these criteria are analyzing different things that the Coastal Commission has jurisdiction over. And so what we're doing is, you know, we're using some professional judgment here on the different criteria that we need to assess, and then how we expect the permitting for this project to turn out. And that's just based on, you know, doing these types of permits and working with the Coastal Commission and other resource and regulatory agencies that will also be involved. So, we're working through the entire process step by step, and considering all of those things as we go through each of these criteria.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Nick. I'm gonna bring this one up. It's not totally on topic of the criteria, but I think it speaks to some of the issues that are probably on a lot of people's mind. It's bottom line, this is from Anonymous, bottom line, where's all the funding coming from? What's the anticipated budget to study and to implement? I don't necessarily want to get into the details in that, Jamie, unless you want to, but I wanted to speak kind of to the question of, to what extent are fundability questions part of the criteria? And to what extent as part of this analysis, are we thinking about, you know, whether or not a project site could be funded by, say, a state or federal grant or something like that?
Sure, I can speak to that. So what what we're seeing is a lot of interest in this project, and that's because it is a pilot project. We're testing something that hasn't been done before, and there are a lot of folks trying to figure out how they're going to grapple with sea level rise, how they're grappling with beach erosion issues. And I'm sure many of you are following a lot of different social media and a lot of different, periodicals about this as well. And so what we feel is that we're putting forward a really good pilot project that has a lot of checks and balances, a lot of adaptive management programming, and a lot of potential here to showcase something that really will work and that will really provide wide benefits that the Coastal Act actually tries to provide, and that we're right in alignment with those Coastal Act objectives. So we really strongly feel that this project is going to be supported by federal and state grants. We also have philanthropic interests, and just in June, the City Council approved a new beach restoration fund that will be separate from other funds, and we'll be utilizing that new funding source to continue to develop studies and to continue to do the science that needs to support this project.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to bundle a couple more questions, and we'll probably start moving things along, and anything we don't get, we'll try to circle back if there's time at the end. And there will be another Q&A period, of course. But there's a question on the whole reason for doing the Rebeach design competition was to reflect the urgency of the need and to create some energy behind these challenges and to get some things unstuck that had been, not happening for a while. So there's a couple questions. One is from Anonymous. Does the long overdue Army Corps of Engineers project that recognizes the Marine Corps base's responsibility for our sand deficit as detailed in Representative Levin's congressional testimony above? I think the link to that will show once I click this button. How does that factor into the Rebeach project funding strategy? Kind of piggybacking on the last comment, Jamie. So how does the Army Corps process and their potential funding and mitigation of impact responsibilities fit into this project? And jumping to another question, just to cluster, does constructability or any other criteria include a time component or factor? We need to get this done ASAP. So there's kind of the urgency thing. There's the kind of waiting for action to happen thing. To what extent in the multi-criteria analysis are we thinking about implementability and the kind of timeframes as we're thinking about the ideal piloting site? So Jamie, maybe I'll start with you, and Nick, if there's anything else.
So the Army Corps of Engineers, we're working with them consistently on trying to get going on the mitigation study that has been put forth as a bill or as a law to that the Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy, the Marine base north of us is at fault and will be paying for the study in its entirety to determine the extent of beach erosion issues that that harbor has caused Oceanside. That study was kind of promised in 2000, and so you can see that it's very much delayed, which is why the city of Oceanside has decided not to continue to wait for that study to get done, because that study then has to go into design, and then that design has to go into construction. And those are just different buckets in the federal way of doing things. This is how the Army Corps kind of separates out how the project gets implemented. So it will be a long time still before the Army Corps of Engineers study gets totally completed, or I should say before the implementation of the study gets completed. However, we are working with Congressman Levin's office, and they are helping to get that study moving forward, and we do expect it to get done within the next few years. The complications that came up around the study, that revolved around the sediment source. So if you can think back to maybe 6 months ago, San Clemente received some sand from the sediment source that was also expected to go to Oceanside. that sand became, it was found that that sand was filled with cobble and it was an inappropriate material to place on the beach. So one of the complications that happened with this last iteration of funding for the Army Corps mitigation study was that they needed to go and find a different source of sand for our beaches, because clearly that didn't work for San Clemente and it wouldn't work for Oceanside either. So we're still working with them. As you kind of see around the region, there's a new 50-year or an implemented 50-year beach nourishment project in Encinitas and Solana Beach and in San Clemente. That is kind of what we're expecting to see in Oceanside. And so that would be sand, most likely. And we don't know that for a fact yet because the study isn't complete, but it would likely be sand, which would fit right in with our Rebeach Oceanside project, which intends to retain more sand rather than letting it slip away without any retention mechanisms. And I'll let Nick answer the other question.
Yeah, and in terms of, you know, maybe not micro, but like a lower time threshold and how it applies to the criteria, the public-private property entitlements and the construction costs are where you would see kind of those time elements built into the multi-criteria analysis through those public-private property entitlements. And this kind of gets to another question, you know, if that's a constraint that's just fully determinant of the pilot and potentially precluding expanding it. You know, we, again, as in some of our statements at the beginning, you know, we view it's feasible. It just might take longer. There's uncertainties, there's additional obstacles and challenges associated with those navigating that. On the construction cost side, it's more just the practical logistics. If a construction staging area is farther from the project site and there's just not the space, they're going to have to build the haul route, bring in more material. It'll take longer, increase the cost because it just takes longer. And that's where kind of on the micro scale, the time has been incorporated. But I don't think that's necessarily what that question was asking for in terms of like big picture timing.
Great. Well, more questions are coming in. We're going to keep things moving and start talking about the different segments and kind of how this analysis is thinking about the kind of the different potential configurations. So continue to add your questions. We're going to circle back before the end of the next hour and do another round of Q&A. I see some more coming in just as I'm talking. So we'll come back and get to as many as we can. And again, anything that we're not kind of vocalizing live, we're trying to type responses in the answers too. So if you go into the Q&A tab, if you haven't explored it yet, not only can you type your questions in as we're presenting, but you can also see the answers of previous questions. So I do encourage you guys to take a look at that. There's already been some great questions answered by the team and great questions asked by all of you. And we'll just continue as we go into the next hour.
Sam, do you mind if I just answer this last question that came in?
About
just while we already
Surfline?
have it. Yeah.
Sure, no problem.
And hopefully, yeah, now that you click that, I think everyone on the webinar can, excuse me.
I
just drank
can
coffee.
read it out loud just to make sure
everyone on the webinar can read it. The question is, are there plans to install, oh, I just lost it. Are there plans to install Surfline cameras at the project site? There's concern about the public versus private, and that Surfline's kind of profits from the privatized access to the beach cam. And there's concerns about getting approval through a public vote for using that technology. I'll say at this point, you know, we are very much looking at surfing as a core resource. And while there has been attempts to monitor surfing in California from a project kind of before after impact for a specific permit, there's not really a standardized approach, and Surfline has machine learning technology that we could utilize to help us understand potential impacts or benefits that the pilot project could cause. And so we have been exploring that as a tool for future pre-construction, post-construction monitoring. I'm interested to learn more about these concerns, maybe offline or through separate threads. So happy to learn more about the concerns about this and maybe a little bit more details about this going forward.
Thanks, Nick. Helpful to kind of address that up front. It's a really interesting topic, and again, the project team has talked about these issues a lot. So happy to be able to address that. Let's move right along. I'm going to pass it back to Nick to
Yeah,
kind of
I'm trying to
talk through
find my. Oh, sorry.
which screen are you on? All right, so again, put those questions in. We've cleared most of them. So good work, team. And we'll just keep moving along. So back over to you, Nick.
Sorry, I'm trying to find my PowerPoint.
I know,
buttons.
so many screens and windows.
There we go. Okay, so this next part of the presentation, I know there were some questions in this Q&A about the design, kind of design dimensions and characteristics. I'm going to kind of briefly touch on those from the pilot project conceptual level, and then move into each of the segments and some potential layouts. Excuse me. So as I noted at the beginning, we are taking ICM's design kind of as was submitted through the design competition. You can see them here kind of laid out, and these are kind of inclusive of all the buffer materials that have been proposed within the headland, thinking about the traditional berm and that rocky outcrop that extends from that feature. And then on the reef side, looking at that original concept and the dimensions associated with that. Just a note, as we move through the engineering design and numerical modeling and likely physical modeling, we're anticipating that these will be modified to fit and to be optimized for that particular location that we select. On the nourishment side, as Jamie mentioned, there's nourishment onshore and in the near shore. That's a part of that initial construction. And we're also looking at that operational or maintenance nourishment, either from the annual harbor dredging or through a re-nourishment that either could be that Army Corps eventual, if that pans out, or a separate, nourishment activity. We are looking at continuing to assess the feasibility of a sand distribution system to try to maximize the efficiency and persistence of sand, and just give the city another tool in the toolbox to manage the coastline. Compiling all these elements, the structural two headlands and the reef, and then the nourishment, we kind of get this conceptual view. I'll go into placing those in the different segments now. So again, we looked at kind of all possible layouts of connecting the headlands to those public accessway while keeping the spacing consistent between the headlands and using the ICM kind of guidance that was part of the design competition. I'll be presenting essentially kind of the top two layouts, including one recommended layout for each of the segments in this next section of slides. So walking through segment one, just kind of orienting you to the graph and some of our symbology, you'll see that coastal access points are indicated by that foot symbol. Lifeguard towers are the traditional kind of, I think that has a name, but I'm blanking on it at the moment. Plus sign, restrooms, parking lots, city kind of park facilities in the segment, as well as kind of the strand. And these are going to be consistent symbology throughout the next few slides. So when we look at segment one, we recognize that it's entirely this public street with a lot of pedestrian access. There's a lot of formal coastal accessways and other amenities, restrooms, showers, parking lots. The public road, the strand, is along that shoreline, and it's approximately 90% public property, mostly public property. As we look at kind of the on the ground situation, this segment on the northern end is the segment that has sort of the most dry sand cobble that persists along this project area that we're looking at. That's on the left side of the screen. You can see more northern area of the segment, closer to almost Tyson Street Park in that background. And then on the right, further south in the segment is where that beach really, really starts to narrow, and we start kind of merging, even at a low tide, the water with the cobble and riprap and revetments kind of mixed. And I appreciate Save Oceanside Sand for sending us some photos to really help us understand the conditions out there. In segment 1, our recommended layout ended up at Tyson Street and Wisconsin Avenue. And I'll walk through in just a moment how we got to that. So the recommended layout at Tyson Street and Wisconsin Avenue is really fully supported by all the existing shoreline amenities, lifeguard towers, restrooms, parking lots, park space, and formalized access ways. I'll show you in just a moment the kind of runner-up potential layout. There's equal considerations for kind of that headland connectivity and property boundary, but the southern end of that segment avoids potential impacts with existing sandy beach habitat, surf resources focused around the pier. So and another way to say that is we're hoping to remove the project from those existing resources to try to limit any potential in those areas, both surfing and sandy beach habitat. So the considered layout for segment 1 was at Seagaze and Ash, kind of on the northern end of this segment. And again, that footprint starts to encroach on the dry beach area, which could potentially cause more impacts to habitat, as well as surf resources closer to the pier that are more consistent because of that pier structure and feature, as well as, recognizing that the Ash Street isn't as high quality of a coastal access point, specifically compared to kind of the Wisconsin Avenue, where you have the major roadway, the parking lot, lifeguards, and restrooms. Moving down the coast and looking at segment 2, again, there's a number of coastal access points symbolized by those footprints. We have lifeguard towers, some restrooms at Wisconsin and Buccaneer, parking at Wisconsin and Buccaneer, and I believe it's called Lot 26, up closer to the rail corridor. This shoreline approximately has 30% public property with about 70% private property. In looking at the beach, this is kind of typical conditions, or where it's really, really not a lot of dry, sandy beach area. There is some kind of cobble berm, persistent cobble berm that integrates into the revetments, with riprap lining most of the area. There are coastal access points at Hayes, and the Oceanside Boulevard vehicle ramp presents kind of an opportunity. We'll also note that there's an ocean outfall from the La Salina wastewater plant that's kind of directly offshore, what we've called the Pacific Street Ped Path, but essentially this easement here, if you can see my cursor. And so the recommended layout for segment 2 is Wisconsin Avenue and Oceanside Boulevard. And I'll walk through this rationale for that location. So again, that layout really looks at all the existing shoreline amenities and how it's getting supported by the existing lifeguards and those coastal access ways. It also has more connectivity to public property, in particular, the strand of thinking of a more kind of connective beach area across that entire part of the segment. It also has slightly more public property, which lowers that potential risk on private property. And so for the considered layout for this segment, we looked at Oceanside Boulevard and what we called North Buccaneer Beach, so kind of the north side of the inlet there. And really, we were, thinking about the available space for that headland connection, as well as the access ways. So in looking at, in particular, Hayes and Forster Street have more formal or, kind of better access compared to Crosswaith or Witherby. And additionally, in looking at this ocean outfall pipe off La Salina wastewater plant, you can see it here on the map as a black dashed line that represents some constraints in terms of specific location and making sure that for the reef, and making sure that we wouldn't want to put it too close to that to present any potential risks to that infrastructure feature. Moving along the coast to segment 3, there are kind of 4 public pedestrian coastal access points in this area. We have the amenities at Buccaneer Beach, obviously, and then this section of coastline has the most amount of private property compared to public property. And as we look at the shoreline, it's similar to segment 2 in just the lack of dry usable beach area and the eroded condition of that very narrow band of cobble and some sand right against those revetments. So the recommended layout for segment 3, we landed at, what we'll call South Buccaneer Beach and Cassidy Street, kind of prioritizing those two coastal access amenities and features, the lifeguards, the parking lot, restrooms at Buccaneer, and incorporating that into the pilot project. So again, that northern layout for this segment really maximizes those existing shoreline amenities. It allows for a little bit more programming opportunity, and by I mean programming opportunity, just the available space of that headland, just considering how narrow those bands are of public property along that shoreline. And in thinking of either the potential impacts to private property or views of private properties, when we looked at this alternative layout at kind of the Whaley Street pedestrian area and then that other easement pedestrian path at the very southern end, these were not as high quality as the leveraged coastal amenities that we saw present in that northern alignment at South Buccaneer and Cassidy Street. So throwing these all together on a map, we landed at these recommended recommended layouts per each segment. So again, in segment 1, it's Tyson and Wisconsin. In segment 2, Wisconsin Ave and Oceanside Boulevard. And in segment 3, South Buccaneer and Cassidy Street. So I'm going to kick it over to Jamie real quick to talk about some next steps before we move to questions and answers.
All right. So thanks, Nick, for all of that. And I see more questions coming in. So this is great. I really appreciate everyone giving us feedback like this and allowing us to answer some questions because we are in it. We are in the thick of it. So the public outreach for all of this really has just begun. So we expect to continue to do this type of outreach. Well, we're going to do one more webinar like this, and then we're going to do some pop-up events throughout the summer. So this isn't your last chance to kind of get some feedback into us. And we're going to be providing also a survey that will be available on rebeach.org after this webinar. But we'll also have these like one-on-one opportunities throughout the summer. Most of the time, we're probably going to be doing some pop-ups at the farmers markets and maybe even the night market, and hopefully some surfing events and other public events at the pier. Because the information from this outreach is going to be used to do our multi-criteria analysis. So that is the scoring of each of these criteria, which really guides the decision on which segment these recommended layouts will receive the pilot project. So that multi-criteria analysis is really the next thing to happen after we do some more outreach. And then from there, we expect to bring our findings from the public outreach efforts and from the project team multi-criteria analysis. We're going to bring that to City Council with a recommendation. And we'll be doing that likely in fall, and it will be a council workshop item. So it'll be a workshop that's dedicated to discussing the siting specifically. So simultaneous with the public outreach, and there were a couple of questions that came in about this. We are wrapping up our offshore sediment investigation and the reporting on that. The pilot project includes placement of sand from offshore sources. And so the project team has been conducting an analysis offshore to see if we have more localized sand that we can utilize more readily. And we're seeing some good data on that thus far, but more on that when we conclude the overview of all of the samples that have come in from that offshore investigation. Once the pilot project is selected, we will then be doing that more detailed and extensive numerical and physical modeling of the concept design, and that will help us to determine some more of the details of the design of the structures, and also some of the more details of how much sand we're going to be placing on the beach and how much sand we need to go get from offshore sources. And so once we can conduct that that modeling. We'll have refinements to the design, and we'll keep moving forward with environmental compliance and permitting, which is in several more months, but we're already in discussions with the resource and regulatory agencies. And that started actually very early in this project. So the ongoing other things, we're continuing to do physical monitoring of our shoreline to try and understand the baseline conditions that we'll be setting the pilot project into, and that'll really help us showcase the performance of the pilot and help us understand exactly the dynamics that we are having an influence on. So that baseline monitoring is going to continue, and it has been continuous since 2019. And we've been doing a lot more, even more robust monitoring forthcoming, including exploring some surf monitoring options, which Nick alluded to. And then we're also doing an economic evaluation of the beaches, and that's expected to be completed by the end of the year. The economic evaluation seeks to determine the value or benefits provided by the beach to the city, which helps showcase the need for a restored beach and helps us in attracting construction funding. And then that construction funding is something that we're always going to be looking towards. We're definitely exploring different grant options and trying to build the case for how important this project is and how successful it will be. And so with that, I will kick it back to Sam, and we'll do some more Q&A.
Great, thanks. Really appreciate that. I'm wondering, Nick, if you can jump back to slide 48, which has this. I think this is a helpful slide. I meant the, sorry, 49. Oh, it's different in this. I know you made a slight edit. Okay, in mine it's 48. So I think I want to start with one question that came in, and in the first cluster of questions, I want to focus on the different segments and kind of what it means to have these recommended layouts, and want to make sure everyone understands like how this feeds into the decision process that Jamie just talked through and how we'll be doing the analysis. But the first question is from Anonymous. Seems like the offshore chevrons would require the least amount of public-private conflict or negotiation. Why not adapt the pilot and implement additional chevrons outside the headlands and groins, not just inside? So maybe either Jamie or Nick could take this, but you know.
Yeah, and I might ask this person to maybe submit a clarification. So, you know, the pilot concept that won the design competition that was selected by the city council to move forward is the two headlands with the one reef and beach nourishment that we've been showing. I'm trying to understand if this means kind of foregoing any headlands in exchange for like a hyper near shore reef abutment of some kind. Not trying to put words in this person's mouth, but you know, we're kind of charged and tasked with trying to move this concept as forward, and that's essentially why we've done the analysis this way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the general idea was that there's going to be conflict with headlands because you're tying into these different areas, but the chevrons, which are an artificial reef, can kind of float anywhere. But just to clarify, as Nick just said, the pilot project that won is this system of two headlands with the chevron in the middle, which is why we're not looking at those other things at this moment. But based on the performance of this, you know, the city and others in the region could act to pilot just artificial reefs as well, but that's not currently what we're looking at for the pilot. I'll bring one more up, sand sourcing. Why can't the city of Oceanside access via sand bypass pump system the huge volume of sand which exists in surplus and is seemingly largely underutilized on the southern shores of Camp Pendleton, the sand of which has been prevented to a great degree from drifting south by the marine-based harbor seawall, which was built in the 1940s, which the federal government has already admitted some culpability to. So, Jamie, this is also related to the Army Corps conversation earlier. Curious
Sure.
if you want to hit that.
Yeah, so I've been in discussions with the Navy, with the Marine base, and I mostly interact with their environmental liaisons. And the Marine base has been tasked with addressing sea level rise, just like how all coastal cities and coastal jurisdictions have been. And they one of their methodologies of addressing sea level rise is to utilize the resources that they have on their beaches already. And so they have told me that it's not an option for us to borrow or take from their existing sandy resources, because they're going to need to address sea level rise, and it's in the name of national defense. And so it's not really a very easy argument to have. That being said, we haven't pushed that too far yet. With regard to the SAM bypass system, there could still be an option there that could be reignited. But one thing to note is that one of the reasons why we had a failure of our SAM bypass system early on was that we had a limited amount of sediment actually being transported through the system, and then there was a number of things like kelp that also really hampered the use of that system. I'm sure Nick or Brian could help with that discussion more, but really we just have found that Camp Pendleton is wanting to hold on to the existing natural resources that they have, and I think we can all understand why.
I don't have much to add to that.
Nick, while you're off mute, do you want to tackle the Surfline questions? So
Yes.
just follow up to those. Let me just read them out loud. So why would you choose Surfline versus utilizing public coastal data from Scripps? Surfline being private, and they might have their own agenda versus, a more public interested CDIP. So there's two kind of comments about that. You can kind of take on those.
Yeah, so the Coastal Data Information Portal program is largely the buoy network, and then subsequent localized California, Southern California wave modeling effort run out of Scripps Oceanography. I'm curious to learn more and again maybe dive into the details with some of these folks who asked this question. So feel free to reach out to me to follow up, or maybe submit that in the survey and I can contact you. So essentially, CDIP will give you kind of the buoy readings, the wave predictions and the observations, and then like the MOP lines, these model output points at 10-meter water depth. They're not going to be able to really speak to any changes in surfing from a natural variability, from a wave breaking standpoint from surfing, or natural variability, or sort of construction implementation effects. So I guess I'm trying to I'm curious to understand better how we could use CDIP or some other public information to look specifically at surf monitoring from a natural variability, and then from a impact effects, before after analysis from this project.
Yeah, and thanks, Nick, for that and for the invitation to continue to engage. For those folks who want to kind of suggest some specific ways to use CDIP, I think that would be welcome to the team. But we've looked at it and are familiar with it, but from what we understand, it's insufficient for the type of monitoring that needs to happen. So that's kind of the crux of Nick's comment. I think that let me go to Steve's question. This next phase will pick the site of the first pilot project. Will this phase also select the order of construction of the remaining two segments, or even more potentially? Because we're presenting these three alternatives for the pilot. Will there ever be an effort to consider building another artificial headland at Surfrider? It has good public access, and the location would help the pier area retain sand. So maybe Jamie for that one.
I mean, the pilot project needs to be tested, and we need to showcase how how it's working and that it works. And then we can begin the planning on it. How long do we need to see those benefits before we begin planning? Probably not too long, maybe a couple of years. I think we'll start to see those benefits very fast, especially right after we place the sand. But I think, you know, in general, what we really want to do here is try and get a new tool that can be utilized before we make more plans for the rest of the coast of Oceanside. We certainly wouldn't want to put more structures on the beach and in the water if they weren't working for the objectives that we're trying to achieve. So it can go both ways.
Thanks, Jamie. And to kind of keep on you, or actually I'll open this up. There's a anonymous question about segment 3 and what the kind of, does that, you know, is what's being proposed here, does that preclude the beach south of Cassidy? And I'm going to cluster this with Bridget's question. When choosing which recommended layout, is one factor the way the building as far north as possible may help beaches south of the project site as a side effect. So this is about where we place the pilot and what are the relationships to kind of up and down from the pilot. Brian's typing an answer to the question about Cassidy that'll be specific and visible to everyone, but I guess to revisit Bridget's question, are we thinking about littoral drift and kind of the kind of overall flows, and how does that factor into the pilot site selection? And maybe Nick, you want to take that one.
Yeah, so we've couched kind of a sand supply. We've assumed that we're able to achieve our desired goal for any of the layouts. So, and again, to kind of go back to what the initial pilot project is, we're looking at beach nourishment in between and on both sides of the head, or all sides of the headland. So far north, in between, and south of the southern headland. So I don't know what if preclude means that I'm interpreting it out as unusable. But at least from an initial construction standpoint, if that was the recommended layout to go forward, I would anticipate we would do some initial beach nourishment south of Cassidy.
Thanks, Nick. Moving on to Brandon D's question, is the crest of the reef shown intended to be a feature which benefits surf quality or sand retention, or both? And again, maybe Nick for that one.
So I lost it. I want to make sure I answered it correctly. Shoot. Oh, there it is. So I would say from a general standpoint, the main goal, the main intended benefit of the reef and the headlands is sand retention. However, we do view that the reef could have indirect secondary benefits related to improving wave quality in certain areas or helping the formation of sandbars in a particular area. The crest feature of the particular reef is where we would try to create that initial shoaling. We don't view the reef as a wave breaking platform itself. I think as we get into numerical modeling, different dimensions, orientations, we'll flesh out better how we might be able to answer some of the surf questions of the reef. But again, our primary intent and benefits would be related to sand retention.
Thanks, Nick. I'm gonna jump to Richard's question, which is a clarifying question. Originally, I understood from early statements that the length of the headlands are 150 feet. Your diagram shows the headland in 2 sections, each 150 feet. Can you please clarify this?
Yes, so the sort of at grade the design from ICM had sort of the at grade headland at that 150 feet, and then extending past that was a permeable berm or rocky outcrop that would be lower in profile and be where we could kind of fine tune the retention performance.
Thank you.
Oh, and I'm seeing
and
now oh, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I
I
was
don't mean
gonna
to
say, we got the
backhand
clarification.
facilitate this.
It's fine, Nick, you're great. The follow-up to your previous question, you asked anonymous to please clarify. The person just asking, does segment 3 terminate at Cassidy?
Yes, if my cursor is showing up, that southernmost headland of this recommended layout for segment 3 is at the end of the Cassidy Street accessway.
But Nick, to clarify, segment 3, we
Oh,
analyzed
I'm so sorry.
all of Buena Vista Lagoon. And this was the highest scoring layout within segment 3.
Yes, that's a good clarification. Thank you.
Okay, turning to some more questions, and this might be good for Jamie to answer first, both in terms of an idea about funding and kind of a source of funding, but also about the kind of broader strategy for kind of areas that aren't going to get the benefit of the pilot immediately. So first, and I'll kind of ask both of these, Jamie, or kind of talk through both of these, and you can take them. The first is from Yehuda. In regards to funding support, could there be an opportunity for an economic assessment to quantify a small conservation fee, like $10 a person, for visiting tourists via hotels and resorts that could then be directly allocated to the Rebeach effort? So that's a question about new ways to kind of generate revenue for this. Another anonymous person asks, I appreciate the need to ensure a pilot is successful prior to further implementation, but we also need to recognize that our beaches don't have multiple years. Are there plans to at least pursue sand replenishment for the areas not selected? Those segments have the greatest need. So curious, Jamie, if you want to take both of those.
Sure. So with regard to funding, we expect the Beach Restoration Fund that was established by council just recently, we expect to get more funds from various sources, which could include an increase in transient occupancy tax. That hasn't been fully studied or vetted or discussed thoroughly. But it is an option. It's an option that Encinitas uses. Their community voted on an increase in transient occupancy tax back in the 90s. And that increase goes directly to a beach restoration or a shoreline preservation fund. And so it's exclusive of other uses. It's all dedicated towards beach restoration. And so we're working towards a solution like that, trying to get a more consistent source. There's also some beach restoration aspects of Measure X coming forward. And through our economic evaluation, we're going to be looking into this a little bit more, just to try and flesh out some of the options for getting a more consistent source, because we will need to have that source of funding to ensure that these new structures are maintained thoroughly with sand. And then to tackle the next question, which is regarding sand replenishment. So if one of the Farallon friends can put in the chat that we have this new story map on the coastal management webpage, Oceanside's coastal management webpage. And the story map really goes through what we're doing from the north end of Oceanside down to the southern end. And so one of the things that Oceanside's involved with now is the Sandag Regional Beach Sand Project 3, which is in feasibility now. It's been in feasibility for a couple months. And so we're working towards helping Sandag get that document wrapped up. We're a participant, just like many other cities in San Diego County, in this regional approach to sand nourishment. And we have asked for a substantial amount of sand that is expected to go mostly in South Oceanside. It extends about down to Buccaneer. And so those are a couple more things that we're working on consistently to get going. But these projects do take time because they do not only require a lot of resources, they're expensive, and they also have impacts. So we need to make sure that we're having a thorough analysis of each of these big projects. And, unfortunately, we're just getting going on those. So it will take some time to get actual beach sand back to Oceanside outside of what we've been doing with the Army Corps harbor dredging, which is something that we changed substantially this year. So that's just one more thing that we're looking to continue to tweak to improve the efficient use of sand from that source.
Yeah, and just to vocalize another question that's related to this, and I think you just spoke to a lot of this, but I think it's worth elevating this comment. One interpretation, this is from an anonymous participant, one interpretation from a bird's eye view, a lot of the criteria roll up to the best to showcase capability, which is roughly equal to what's the most feasible. But the same criteria is what has led to inequitable access to visitors and residents who live in North Oceanside versus South Oceanside over time, and a big reason why North is sand rich and South is sand poor. So would like to see the community benefit and equitable access to the beach for Oceansiders used as a criteria. Even though it's intended as a pilot, this has come at the end of a generation's worth of erosion. So there's a proposal here to say, like, a community benefit and equitable access to the beach as like a standalone criteria. So I don't know if you, Jamie, or Nick want to speak to that. But I also do want to highlight the link that Carolyn just dropped in that kind of shows in a more complete way all the different interventions the city is undertaking in this space. But Jamie, do you want to respond to that comment and question as well?
Yeah, I do want to respond because there's not an inequality issue with the sand that is in the north versus in the south. It is a physical issue. It is physically really difficult to extend the small amount of sand that we get from the harbor and put it all the way to the south of Oceanside. For one, this is not a city-led project. This is an Army Corps of Engineers federal project, and their objective is to get the sand out of there. And they don't really care where they put it. We're working towards getting them to care a little bit more. And we did that this year, and they obliged, and it was a great year for harbor dredging. But the issue is really a physical issue. It's really difficult to extend that sand all the way through the entire coast. There's just not enough sand, and it's really far from the source. And we're asking basically for the federal government through this other project to kind of change how they do it. And it's really their project, and we encourage the best use of it. But it's really not this, we're putting the sand in certain areas. It's really a federal project. And also, like I said, there's just not enough sand to expand the entire, to span the entire coastline. So I'll pause there, and maybe if anyone else wants to expand on that, and I'll try and think of more clever answers.
I guess I would say, while a lot of the criteria represent kind of the practical logistics of trying to implement it, again, we view it as feasible. There's just trade-offs associated with the different layouts and segments.
I'll ask another question, this one from Richard Morel. The Solana Beach project has a large sign stating that the project was funded by the, quote, President Joe Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, unquote. Has Oceanside begun the process of applying for these funds? And I'll extend it and saying other funds like these.
So the Solana Beach and Encinitas Army Corps of Engineers 50-year beach nourishment project, that's a coastal storm damage reduction Army Corps project. It's a cost share project that the city of Encinitas and Solana Beach partnered on to make their cost benefit better, because they separately they couldn't really pursue the project, but together they had a cost benefit ratio that allowed the federal government to pay part of that, and then they contributed their local share to that project too. What we have in Oceanside is the beginning of something like the project that Solana Beach and Encinitas received. And that is that feasibility study, or sorry, that mitigation study that I spoke about earlier. That's that project that we're working towards getting that study completed with the help of Congressman Levin's office. And so right now we do have funding for the completion of that study. It's going to take a few years to get that done. And then once that's done, then we will potentially be working towards a more cost share and we'll say traditional approach for those coastal storm damage reduction projects. And we could eventually get there. The Encinitas Solana Beach projects took about 20 to 25 years to get going. And so they do take a long time, and we're expecting the same thing for ours.
Great. Many other questions coming in. I'll ask another from Yehuda. Thanks for all your questions. Regarding nearshore nourishment as part of the pilot project installation, could you please provide information on the optimal time of year for this type of activity? Additionally, is the nourishment performed more than once annually? And have feasibility studies been conducted to determine the ideal timing and frequency to maximize the duration of sand buildup on the beach? For instance, current sand dredging from the harbor occurs in May, but the sand is often swept away within weeks.
I might take a first stab to give Jamie a bit of a break, but yes, so the Army Corps project, as Jamie mentioned, the city has up until this year had very little say in when and how that's performed. I would tend to agree that the May is not the optimal timing given the swell and wave climate. I think for our project, it's going to be several factors. Optimal timing. When do we have the funding secured for implementation? Which dredging vessel is available, and what our permits allow us to do in terms of timing, whether that's a seasonality thing for beach users or for an environmental reason, grunion season, for example. And so we are working through the feasibility from kind of all encompassing from where do we have available sand near Oceanside. We've kicked off our offshore investigation to hopefully identify close, therefore low cost sources of sand to use for the project. And then we'll also look to kind of getting into the questions you've asked about optimal timing, placement, specific placement volumes, and then thinking forward about frequency. I don't think we've landed on exactly more than that it'd be placed more than once annually. I think we were looking at like a 3 to 5 year interval in terms of some type of ongoing maintenance for nourishment. I think I answered all of the questions in there. And so...
Yep, thank you. That seemed clear to me and helpful. Jamie, anything to add to that question? This is Yehuda's question.
Only that there could be some changes to the cycle, the Army Corps of Engineers harbor dredging cycle. And we're working with them on trying to optimize that sand placement. So timing is definitely an issue, but it's an issue kind of either way, anyway you swing it. But we are trying to work with them on a number of tweaks to their program. And if you ever want to really dive into it, the feasibility study from GHD in 2020 does address some of those kind of inefficiencies from the harbor dredging that we are now addressing on a case-by-case basis and a year-by-year basis.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Nick. There have been a couple questions that came in that are kind of related. One is kind of Matt McDaniel's question about, do any of the MCA address benefits specifically the benefit of increasing public access to the beach. So this is the idea that like we're going to do something and it's going to increase public access to the beach. And another anonymous question came in saying, just to clarify and follow up on the last question about equitable access, is public benefit included in the MCA or is it not included in the MCA? So just to cluster those, I think the question is like whether the city, and as part of the decision for the pilot, is thinking about equitable access, increased access, and public benefit as part of the pilot siting decision. So Jamie, I'm not sure if you want to take that first or.
So, I mean, equitable access is considered in the coastal access and amenities criteria. That's kind of what I was discussing earlier, which is that some of these areas, these recommended layouts, got prioritized because there is either a free public parking lot or a low cost option for parking, or you can get to the beach via public transportation. And that is addressing that equitable access and public benefit, meaning like the public get that benefit. They get the access there because beaches are free and they are available to all. But with regard to like what is a public benefit, that there are so many benefits discussed here in all of these criteria. You know, we're addressing lateral beach access, just getting to the beach, just seeing the beach, just getting out on the headland and maybe looking at the ocean, protection of public property and private property, infrastructure protection, that is important. And that is what sand does. It's a soft buffer between the ocean and our infrastructure. Constructability, you know, if the constructability is easier, then we are encumbering the beach less, and that's a benefit. If the construction costs are less, then that takes less tax dollars to create this new space. Biological resources, you know, there are plenty of birders out there, and I'm one of them, and we would like to see some of those shorebirds come back to a shoreline. And then of course, surf resources. We're always talking about, you know, how we're hoping that we're doing our best to really make sure that we preserve what we have in terms of surf resources, and that we influence those resources in a positive way. So I think all of these criteria address benefits. It's just kind of what's your use of the beach, and what's the benefit that's going to give what benefits will this project give to you? Sorry, getting late.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to jump right into a new question from Steve. I may have missed a discussion on how the criteria will be weighted in the scoring. It seems that some of the criteria are much more important than others, or are all criteria to be considered equally? Nick, do you want to speak to the weighting and some of the sensitivity analysis that we did?
Yeah, so at this point, you know, we have these criteria. We're looking for kind of public feedback. Are these the right things to look at? Did we miss anything? And conceptually, you know, we can look at either having equal weights for other criteria, and looking at previous kind of MCAs of doing kind of a sensitivity check of, you know, tweaking some of the knobs. Maybe that's cost, maybe it's ecological, environmental, maybe it's kind of cultural, social, safety, and surfing, and seeing if, you know, changing the weighting of some of those categories or certain criteria alter the ultimate tally. And I think that's something we'd be looking to do as we complete this analysis.
Thanks, Nick. Hopefully that answered your question, Steve. Happy to follow up more. We're coming in on the end. We're trying to answer all the questions. I think we're pretty close. There's one more that I think should get asked. It's a great question. It's from Melvin. Are there opportunities to volunteer or to be part of this project in any form or fashion? So Jamie, what are you looking for from folks like Melvin and others on this call to continue to be involved?
Well, I mean, your contribution right now is really what we want. We want public feedback, and we want for folks to spread the word about what we're working on, and that we've done a thorough analysis about kind of every aspect of this project thus far. And if there are volunteer opportunities, like physical volunteer opportunities, I will start to think about that one, because I do think there's a lot of help we could get from the community. And I with all the attendees today and in the past, I feel like I do need to kind of focus on that. So I'll get back with you, but reach out to me directly. Thanks.
Great, thanks. There's one more question that just came in, but I think we'll type an answer to that because it's a good question. There's kind of a straightforward response to that. But let's kind of move to start closing up. Maybe go to the next step slide just to kind of restate some of those things. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who has been part of this conversation today. If there's folks in your community, your neighbors, family members who couldn't make it tonight, make sure they know about the Thursday webinar, 3 to 5. You can register right on the Rebeach website. There's a link to the Zoom, and there's also more information on the city's website as well about these. If they can't make it this week, we're going to record it. We're going to put on we're going to put it on the website, hopefully by the end of the week, or certainly by early next week. So you can forward, the link to the YouTube so that people can watch this and get all the information. And for all the questions that are being asked, we're going to be, synthesizing and compiling this and updating our frequently asked questions page on the Rebeach website. So we're trying to build up a resource that makes it easy for people to understand where we are in the process, what's going on, what are the questions we're answering right now. And we want to, continue to kind of get feedback through fora like this. We're also going to be doing in-person tabling over the next several months. There's going to be more public workshops, and there's going to be, of course, more city council decisions and public meetings such as that. If you're signed up to the Rebeach mailing list, which is on rebeach.org, you will get invitations to all these things. So make sure you go to the Rebeach website, again, rebeach.org, and sign up for the mailing list. And that will help you ensure that you can stay connected. Anything else anyone from the team wants to add before we close out? This has been an awesome hour and 50 minutes. Anything else?
I just want to say
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for all the thoughtful questions and your time and your feedback. I really hope you can spend a little bit more time and take the survey and provide us any additional details. Really value your input, and thank you again for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you. We made it
Thank
through
you.
45 amazing questions, and we'll have all of those answers in the follow-up. So thanks so much, and we'll be in touch. Thanks all.
Thank you.